One of the concerns today, you hear a lot about this idea of the return of Christ and what that is. Revelation really, as far as the kind of material that that is how it starts out. It is the apocalypsis, and that it means to reveal or unveil, and the person that is unveiling is Jesus Christ. And what John is trying to do for us is to show us how that all will work out at the end of the age. Interesting points about this is that if you go back and you bring all of the strands of prophecy together, we really have a mediator that stands in the middle of this and gives us clarity. There are really two of them. One of them is Jesus himself in Matthew 24 and 25, or Mark 13, depending on which of those you want to use. Jesus basically, for instance, gives us some temporal elements or some signs that we might see that would lead to the time. For instance, as I mentioned that Daniel was the headwaters of some of this, Jesus himself says about Daniel, he says, how do we know the time, his disciples said? How will we know these things? And as he began to recite the things that will happen at the end of the age, he says, you'll know when the abomination of desolation is in place, as given to us by the prophet, and Jesus calls him prophet, the prophet Daniel. Then we have some very common language that comes through Daniel and the other prophets too, Zechariah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Zephaniah, and others that we see in the prophecy of Paul. There's one thing about Paul that we always must remember. Although Paul is what we consider the epitome of what a Christian church planner should be in our age, Paul was primarily a Jewish rabbi. That was his occupation, and that had been all of his training. In fact, on 3 different occasions when he gives his testimony, that's how he talks about himself. That he had all of this training, sat at the feet of one of the great teachers, and Gamaliel, and is this trained rabbi. So Paul is interpreting for us what he understands to be how the end of the age will come about, based on the fact that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. He does this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and then the great resurrection passage in 1 Corinthians 15. In those, he gives a synopsis of how he understands that the end of the age will be, and what we connect that to, if we see some hermeneutical principles that we could use, is that we try to take those things that Paul talks about, the Parousia, which, by the way, is the other bookend of the ministry of Christ. His death, burial, and resurrection is one side of that, and then his Parousia, and then whatever comes beyond that is the other part. But in that, Paul talks about the trumpet. And one wonders if the last trumpet of Paul is the 7th trumpet of John, you see. If it is, then you have a connection where you can tie those two together and see how this works out on a temporal plane. Paul is, I think, significant to us in many ways. He wrote, in most cases, 10 years prior to the Gospels, and I think that it's very also an important thing to understand that Paul was in Ephesus for on at least 2 different occasions for a period of time there, likely traveling with Luke. Obviously, we know, although we're never told in the Scripture what those connections are, we know that there was some sort of connection there. For instance, it seems clear that, like with Luke, that the first couple of chapters of the Gospel of Luke were heavily influenced by somebody who was an eyewitness to the events around the birth of John the Baptist and also the announcement and ultimate birth of Jesus. Perhaps that's Mary, who maybe accompanied John after the cross event on his journeys that led him out and carried him to Ephesus. But there Paul and Luke and these people are there, and this is where I believe is the anvil where all of this is pounded out, and some of the theology and eschatology of the Old Testament is brought fresh and new into the New Testament with the understanding that Jesus is indeed the Messiah.